We're going to do a quick summary, but super quick. 28A1. Okay, I'm just going to read the entire discussion. All right. We started off obviously on the Mishnah. I'm hearing background shushing. Sorry, guys. All right. The Mishnah discusses another case in which a pitcher caused damage in the public domain. If one's pitcher of water broke in the public domain and a person slipped on the water, was injured by a shot from the broken pitcher, the owner of the pitcher is liable to pay for the damage. A dissenting view, Rabbi Yehuda says, where the owner of the pitcher had intent, he is liable, but where he did not have intent, he is not liable. Just one quick screen share with you guys. Okay, if you have a look, this particular Mishnah in Bava Kamma was not the two lines that we're dealing with here, because here we're dealing with, if you can see my mouse, if one's jug broke in the public domain and another person slipped in the water from the jug and was injured from the fall, or was injured by the shards of the broken jug, the owner of the jug is liable. Rabbi Yehuda says in this case where the owner of the jug acted with intent, he is liable, and in the case where he acted without intent, he is exempt. So that part of the Mishnah joins on the previous one, which talks about the interchangeability of a kad and a chavit or chavis. Okay, so it is actually one Mishnah, but the Gemara breaks it up in two. All right, just to fly through, the Gemara qualifies the Tana Kamma's ruling in the case where the pedestrian slipped on the water. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, they did not teach that the owner of the pitcher is liable, except where the victim's clothes were soiled by the water. But if the victim himself was harmed, in other words, he slipped on the water and injured himself on the ground, the owner of the pitcher is not liable because it was ownerless ground that damaged him. Now, I already said yesterday I had a bit of a problem because most logic would dictate that if I was under a ladder and I knocked the ladder and you fell to the ground, I couldn't claim that the ownerless ground injured you because me knocking the ladder or leaving a hazard in the public domain is what caused you to slip on the ground. We also said that Shmuel does in that particular case cover that immediate ground surface within a pit, but if you fall out of the ground area, it's going to be a problem. So where is the problem? I said to Rabbi Cohen, I sent him a message on both fronts, is that if somebody left their stone, their knife, or their burden, which is a torda of bor, in the public domain, you would have to land with your head exactly in that small diameter or circumference of obstruction in order to be covered by Shmuel, it would seem. And then apart from which, if you say there is a small puddle of water, Gavin, I sent a message on Rabbi Cohen's phone. I said, so let's just not talk about the torda here. Let's talk about a case. By the way, the water, if the water was in the public domain and you slipped on it, that is actually not a pit. Why? Because the biblical verse, Kevin, of pit is a pit. Yeah. Anything that would create a hazard in the public domain is a torda. So therefore, if the water was a small puddle like this, right? Small puddle like that, you slipped in it, and if after slipping in it, your head happened to be, if your body's 6 foot or 5.5 feet or whatever the height you are, I'm the hobbit size, it's still unlikely I would fall in that patch of water, and if I slipped, I would hit my head on the ground. So there, even Shmuel wouldn't cover you because that's not within the circumference of what he calls the damage within the pit ground. So I'm having a problem with that, and that's Tosfot's response to Shmuel's explanation of coverage. But at least Shmuel says you're covered by the ground that injures you, whereas Rav says you're only covered by the foul air if you dig a pit in the public domain, not you. If somebody else dug a pit in the public domain and you fell in it, then you would be, the other person would have to pay for the foul air you breathed or the water or something that you swallowed within that particular pit. Shmuel said you would be covered for bodily damage. But the problem is if the circumference of that bit of water you slipped in unless you fell like this, like a first class diver, and your head hit exactly in that little puddle, according to Tosfot, Shmuel would not cover you. So that's the problem I posed to Rabbi Cohen. Rabbi Cohen is going to get back to us. There is an opinion that's not Tosfot that says that Shmuel does cover you for that surface area that you fell in. Slightly out of it, perhaps. I don't know. All right, so let's just go on. So these are the issues that we're dealing with so far. So Rav Yehuda reported Rav's explanation to Shmuel, who proceeded to challenge it. What we said is that Rav Yehuda was a student of Rav, and when Rav passed away, he went to study under his contemporary. And who is his contemporary? His contemporary is, well, Rav's contemporary was Shmuel. So often what would happen is he would tell Shmuel what Rav's opinion was, his former teacher, on certain issues. And this is where there was a discussion that took place. Because it's when I related it before Shmuel, he said to me, this is Rav Yehuda reporting the challenge. He said, let us see, we derive the law that one is liable for damage inflicted by one stone, knife, or burden, or any other hazardous object one leaves in the public domain, such as water, in this case, from the pitcher, from the law of one's pit. And hence, in all these cases, I apply the rule. This is Shmuel talking. The owner is liable for an ox, but not for a person. He's liable for a donkey, but not for utensils. And where did we get this from? We got this from Shemot, Exodus chapter 21, verse 33 and 34, where it says, and if a man shall uncover a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution, and the carcass shall be his. So there, where it's talking about an ox or a donkey, it's obviously excluding man, and it's also excluding the load that the donkey has upon it. Hence utensils. It's exclusionary. Okay. So no questions. No questions yet. A minute, Kev. Sorry, mate. Let's just cover a little bit of ground. This is summary. I will give
cool. Sorry,
questions.
Okay.
So he said, in all these cases, I apply the rule that the owner is liable for the dogs, for like the animal that falls in, the ox or the donkey, but not for a person. And he is liable for a donkey, but not for utensils. Okay. So, and these laws, with regards to not being liable for a person or utensils, apply with regard to a fall resulting in death. Okay. So what we're saying is here is Shmuel doesn't have a problem, it seems, to cover for injury of a person. It's not having an exclusionary cause for injury. Why? Because we learned specifically that you have to make restitution. But what we discussed yesterday is you can't have where you maybe, say I was, example, injured in a pit, and that pit gave me 150 zuz worth of damage, right? And then all of a sudden, that person would be liable to pay for that damage, for me to, the Nezek Shalom, to recover. But another person fell into a different pit, another guy made, but he happened to die in that particular pit. So it's not that that guy doesn't get paid anything, because that doesn't make sense. The family has lost a breadwinner, and now you're saying that if he got injured, the person would have to pay for the damage his pit caused, but not if it killed him, because obviously then every pit owner would wish the person would die in his pit so he could get out a payment. So that's not clearly the case. The case is that you would have to pay, obviously, whatever amount was calculated for death, which I'm sure is probably the same as the worst injury. But what you don't have to pay is the kofar liability, the atonement portion, because your pit, or those with hazardous, you were not warned multiple times that it could cause somebody's death. And therefore, you don't have the same level of responsibility in Shemayim, because it wasn't like you were warned about how this could kill somebody, how it could kill somebody, how it could kill. Yes, you were negligent, and yes, you were reckless, but you weren't insensitive to the degree that no matter how many times you were warned, you didn't get rid of this animal that could cause death. Does that make sense, guys? So therefore, the kofir payment does not occur with regards to pets. So that is what Shmuel is saying, is that, listen, we know that you don't pay for a human being resulting in death. We know that you also don't pay for utensils. But with regard to a fall resulting in mere damage, he is liable for a person that gets injured, but not for utensils. Thus, the owner of the hazard in the public domain is never liable for damage to utensils. Accordingly, our Mishnah cannot be speaking of a case where the water from the pitcher damaged the victim's clothes, which are classified as utensils. So far, Shmuel is seeming to imply that, listen, I can understand where the Gemara is talking about a case, Shmuel saying, where the person gets injured on the water in the pit and hits the ground. And according to Tosaf, that ground immediately where that puddle of water is. And if that's the case, the person gets injured. I get that. I agree you have to pay for that. But this does not talk about a case where you have to pay for a person's clothes that got damaged as a result. So the interchangeable word I wanted to use here instead of water is, let's take a liquid that perhaps stains. Like in a pitcher, firstly, water is valuable, but it's not as valuable as wine or oil. So in that particular case, I'm using that example for two reasons. The first reason is its ability to stain clothing. So that would mean that her clothes are ruined. Does that make sense? So therefore, Rav said that you'd be responsible for her, because when he talks about utensils, he uses the classic word meaning utility, to use. And therefore, clothing is something that a human being loses, Kevin, to cover themselves. In other words, we think of utensils as a spatula in the kitchen, but a utensil can also be clothing, because the utility of a utensil is it covers the body. So therefore, utensil is a utility. So Rav said, listen, the clothing got soiled. And so I'm saying, let's imagine a pitcher of wine that's spilled. It went on a nice white dress and you're responsible for paying. So Shmuel's argument is you don't pay for utensils, therefore damage to clothing by staining it or whatever the case may be, you don't have to pay for that, because this is a case of bor, and we don't pay for utensils that it damages. If she got injured, yes, you pay for that, but you don't pay for the clothing. Fine. Why am I using this example of wine instead of water? Because that would suit Rav's explanation as well. Why? Because Rav considers, as we're going to learn, that it's not considered halachically a case purely of a bor, which is a pit, but it's considered a shore, which is an ox, meaning that wine is something that is valuable to you. And if you could suck it back on the ground and instantaneously go back in time and put it in the container, you wouldn't want to just throw it out your window. It's valuable. Therefore, in your heart and your mind, you haven't declared it ownerless. So it's considered your property. And just like if your ox, which is your property, damages, you're responsible. Like if your ox walks on somebody's utensil, not in the public domain because you're exempt for shane and regal, um, but if it's in somebody else's property and it damages something in their garden, like a garden gnome or something, you'd have to pay for it. Or if the ox knocked a child over and then ruined their clothing, etc., you pay for that. So therefore, because he sees it as a category of your possession, because you haven't relinquished ownership, we would say in that case, because the wine is valuable, like a 15-year-old Chardonnay or whatever the case may be, that he'd see it as responsible for the person that made the pit to pay for the woman's dress, under the category of shore, which is ox, meaning your possession created the damage. If that person, for example, did spill water, but that water for them was neither here nor there in terms of cost, they had a lot of access, and it ruined her dress because it was dirty water, then Rav in that case would say you don't have to pay for it because it's considered a bore, a pit. Okay? So this is the bone of contention, is that Shmuel said, listen, why would you pay for it? Because under the category, he sees it as bore, a pit, and therefore any damage to utensils, meaning utility clothing, you don't pay for. But you would pay if the pit injured her. So in summary, that's all we up to. Let me finish reading, then I'll answer Kevin's question. So the Gemara defends Rav's view, but Rav would answer this point. In other words, the laws of an obstacle in the public domain are derived from those of a pit, apply only where the owner declared the hazard ownerless. But where he did not declare the hazard ownerless, it is his property. In other words, it's seen under the category of an ox. And just like if your ox did damage because it's your property, you're responsible for the clothing or utensils. In this case, our Mishnah speaks of where the owner of the pitcher did not declare the water ownerless, and hence its laws of an ox, including liability for damage to utensils, because he said he used the word tzad hamaveh, which is the common characteristic, meaning there's a common characteristic in one's ox and one's pit. What is it? The common characteristic is there are unique characteristics. A pit is prone to damage from inception, and ox is not stationary. A pit is stationary. So an ox has to go out to damage. That's unique, and it's not prone to damage from inception because you've got a concept of a tame ox, which means it's not automatically muad. So it's not prone to damage from inception. That's unique. A pit is unique in that it's stationary and it's prone to damage from inception. But what have they got in common? Is that it's your obligation to look after things that you cause or you've actually created, and if it damages, the onus is on you to make restitution through the common characteristic. And that's how Rav would see it. So before we go on, that is a summary of yesterday. I hope that is abundantly clear. Kevin, what's your question?
So that is the reason that that there's no liability, that there is only liability for donkeys and ox falling in a pit, is because they don't have rational thought. They don't see. They don't know. Is that the reason? They don't know. They can't judge, and like a human can at least should see what's ahead of him and tread lightly. And walk carefully. Is that the reason?
So the thing of it is, the reason primarily is the biblical verse. That's what we base everything on. Why the biblical verse says it, that's the question you're asking. In other words, why does it specify an animal as opposed to a person? Because the biblical verse dictates the law, but why would the biblical verse say an animal? So we had two kind of contradicting views. In the previous brisa, when we talk about a guy on his bicycle, a pedestrian that crashes in a barrel, we say a person can't be expected to walk ahead of them, to look ahead of them, because they can't expect them to look down, because they're wrapped up in their thoughts, and their eyes look forward because they're not on all fours. The minute you're on all fours, you're looking down, and a human being isn't responsible if he crashes into a barrel, according to the one opinion, because he's looking ahead of him and is consumed in his thoughts. So that would contradict that very simply because a human being in that particular case, although he's got wisdom that he should see a pit ahead of him, his eyesight is fixed forward because he's not on all fours and his thoughts are elsewhere. So that would seem to contradict it. However, there is an opinion exactly like you said, surprise, surprise, two opinions, is that a person has dias, a person has wisdom, and therefore can see when there's a hazard ahead of them, whereas an animal has got not the faintest clue that something would be ahead of them to cause danger. And the proof for this is often you have a chihuahua that would attack a Rottweiler. Now, why on earth would something, a battery-operated stick insect of a dog, attack something that could rip it to pieces in 2 seconds? Stupidity and lack of perception. So therefore, that's a proof for Kevin. What he's saying is that an animal doesn't have automatic concept of something being a hazard. The truth of it is there's arguments both ways. The only reason that we adhere to it is because it's a biblical verse, and since it's in the Torah, we have to adhere to it. Okay. Any other questions before we go on? I hope I've answered it, Kev.
Sure.
Any other questions, guys?
Yeah, that was great. It's perfect.
Okay. All right. So Now we have an issue because it emerges that if someone leaves a hazardous object in the public domain and doesn't declare it ownerless, Rav classifies it as an ox. And consequently, the owner is liable for damage to utensils. So Shmuel classifies it as a pit, and the owner is not liable for utensils. So we stuck at an impasse, as they say. The Gemara cites a brisa that contradicts both of these views. Rav Ashaya challenged both Rav and Shmuel on the basis of the following brisa. Scripture states, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, meaning the pit. This verse is expounded to teach that one is liable for an ox, but not for a person, for a donkey, but not for utensils. From here, the sages derive that if an ox with its utensils falls into a pit and the utensils break, or if a donkey with its utensils falls in the pit and the utensils tear, the owner of the pit is liable for damage to the animal, but not liable for damage to the utensils. So, to what is this comparable? It's comparable to a person's stone, knife, or burden that he has placed in the public domain and it's caused damage. Okay, so now we're hitting a bit of a question. So we're saying, hang on, what do you mean it's comparable? We're firstly talking about a pit where somebody falls, an animal falls in. Now we're talking about a stone and a burden and a knife that happens to be on ground surface. And how does an animal fall in? How is it comparable? It seems like mutually exclusive. Does that make sense? So what we learn is as follows: is that there is an issue. That what is the definition of a pit? It's not the fact that you just fall into it. A pit is a hazard that creates damage. So when we learn the definition of a torda, we learn that an av creates damage in the public domain, and a torda, the subcategories is anything not mentioned in the Torah, but maybe mentioned in the oral Torah as primary examples, and you've got other examples that obviously even the oral Torah doesn't mention. Things can create injury, death, or destruction in the public domain is considered a hazard. And therefore, it's a torda of pit, and you have to pay, as Rav Papa said, the same as you'd have to pay for the av, the main category in the Torah. So the Gemara then also interrupts its quotation of the Brisa, and it says, on the contrary, instead of saying to what is this, in other words, a pit comparable, the Brisa should have stated what is comparable to this. So what it's saying here is that it interrupts its own wording because it says, listen, you can't say something of the Torah, which is derisa, is comparable to something in the oral Torah, because the written Torah is still deemed more important than the oral Torah, because our source of the oral Torah comes from the written Torah. So we can't say that, for example, of the pit is comparable to a stone, a burden, a knife, because it's like saying this, the category is comparable to the subcategory. The category is more important. So the Gemara mends the Bryce and says, hang on, the subcategories are comparable to the main category because the Torah is the most important category where everything comes from, and therefore that's the basis where we compare all subcategories. So it just fixes its wording up, that's all. And it says the Gemara now amends the Bryce accordingly. Rather, read the Bryce as follows. What is comparable to this? In other words, what's comparable to the main of a pit? If a person placed his stone, knife, or burden in the public domain and it caused damage, just as the owner of a pit is not liable for damage caused by his pit to utensils, so too the owner of such obstacles is not liable if they damage utensils. Meaning, told it exactly like the Av, is that if it damages utensils, say you're carrying a laptop and you slip on somebody else's pocket knife and your laptop gets damaged, that person isn't responsible for the laptop that got damaged. So too, if you fell in a pit and you landed laptop first, that's the end of your Apple Mac, and the person's not responsible. So I hope you backed up your hard drive. Okay. So the Gemara contains quoting of the Brisa and says it's using another example. Therefore, if one dashed his flask against a stone left in the public domain and the flask broke, the owner of the stone is liable. So what's saying is you're carrying a flask, okay, and that flask you fell, and that flask immediately landed, and on impact it broke the flask. Whoever left his obstruction or his hazard in that public domain is responsible for the flask. So that's proving that the torda you have to pay for the same as the av, the actual pit. Doesn't make a difference if you fell in the pit and broke your flask, but this seems to contradict that. Why is it
Yeah,
contradict?
it's a utensil.
Exactly, exactly. Is that you shouldn't pay if it's saying that your torda are the same as the av. Why should you pay if the pitcher of water that you're carrying makes somebody slip on it and you broke your utensil? Because we learnt in the main category of pit, you don't pay if a person fell in a pit and broke their laptop. Why would you pay if the torda broke the laptop? Again, because the torda can never be more stringent than the actual av. Does that make sense, guys?
Yep.
Okay.
Sorry, Dem. So what you're saying is the secondary level can never be stronger than the primary level.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying, mate. You couldn't have worded it better. Thank you for that eloquence. So the Gemara shows how this price contradicts the view of both Rav and Shmuel, and well done for Gavin for picking it up, and well done for Arthur's eloquence. Okay, so the Gemara counters, and it's saying, listen, there's a problem. This is a problem for both Rav and Shmuel. How? Okay, so the first part of the brisa, when it says what is comparable to a pit, one stone, knife, or burden poses a difficulty for Rav, because it states that someone's object left in the public domain has the status of a pit. So when it's using a description of the Torah and it says what is it's comparable to a pit, that gives a problem for Rav. Why? Because Rav considers it halachically like one's shore, one's property, one's ox. So here it's saying, no, it's not the category of a shore, it's a category of a bore. The torda, the hazards, the obstructions left in the public domain, the subcategories is the same as the av, and it's actually considered a bore, a pit, not a shore. And therefore, you're not obligated, exactly as Gavin said, for utensil breakage or damage to utility, like a woman's clothing. Okay? So that poses a problem for Rav. This is what Rav Oshaya is bringing as a challenge to Rav and Shmuel. Okay? The Gemara counters is, okay, so how do we see that there's a difficulty with regards to Shmuel? We understood how it's a difficulty with regards to Rav, because the last part of the brisa reads, if one dashed his flask against a stone, the owner of the stone is liable. So that poses a difficulty to Shmuel, because it implies that such an obstacle has the status of one's ox. Okay, so again, Shmuel's got, it's a problem with Shmuel, because exactly as Gavin said, if your flask lands on that hazard, you should be exempt, because it's a utensil that breaks in the pit. And a torda of pit not be, as Arthur said, more stringent than the av of pit, in that both the tordas and the av, you're not responsible for somebody's utensils that breaks in a pit or an object that you leave in the public domain. There's an exemption for utensils. So according to Shmuel, if this is saying that if the person's hazard broke his flask, you'd have to pay for it. It's a problem for Shmuel. Why is it a problem for Rav? Because it uses the word and says the subcategories of pit are the same as a pit. It defines it as a pit, a bore, not a shore. So that's a contradiction to Rav. Now, there should be a greater question that both of you are asking, that this is a contradiction to each other. The first part of the brisa is saying, listen, it resembles a pit. The second part saying that you're not obligated, that you are obligated if your stone dash somebody's utensil, which is completely contrary to the Chumash view of exemption for a pit of utensils. So the brisa, the first part and the second, are contradicting each other. Can you see this, guys? The brisa itself
but don't we have to have a look at this from Rab's perspective, that whether it's ownerless or not ownerless, because that's how you operate.
Get there, but what we have to first determine is first step first. The first step is, let's look at the brisa. Is the brisa itself that Rava Oshaya is bringing is a problem? Why is it a problem? It's a problem to both Rav and Shmuel, but the brisa in and of itself is a contradiction to each other. Why is it a contradiction? Because the first part defines it as a bore, a pit, and the second part says you have to. It says that basically the torda of the bore is the same as the bore. The little hazards of the stone, the knife, and the burden left in the public domain, you have to pay for under the category of bore, a pit. But then it says if somebody dashes their flask against that hazard, that you have to pay for that flask, seems to contradict the Chumash, who said you don't pay for utensils damaged in the bore. Does that make sense? Because you shouldn't be paying for utensils. Or if it's classified as a bore. So the brisa itself contradicts each other. That's the problem, the first part and the second part of the brisa. So apart from a contradiction for Rav and Shmuel, it contradicts itself. So fine, we're going to deal with this tomorrow. I want Kevin to teach us. Rav Kevin Mayer thought.
Just one thing, Damon, just 1 minute to what.
Yeah.
So maybe it's unrelated, but it maybe is related. So utensils, if someone damages them, if someone gets injured on a utensil in the public domain, which is like a knife, is considered like a bore, maybe the level of damage is not as severe as it would be in an actual bore.
No, we learned in the very first thing that Rav Papa said, are the tordos like the Av or are the tordos not like the Av? Is it like Shabbos where the tordos of the Av, if you do it on purpose, you get the death penalty for breaking Shabbos, or you do a chatas offering and it's the same penalty? Or is it like Tumah, where it's less intensity, where you've got the Ava Tumah compared to the subcategories of Tumah? That was the very first stuff that we started with. And it came through that on Bava Kamma, all the tordos were exactly the same as the Av, except for the Sororos, which is a special law from Moshe of Har Sinai. So that is the proof that the tordos require the same payment as the Av. That was the very first stuff brought by Rav Papa. Okay, Kevin, teach us now.
Okay, I've got a few. Some I'll just read it. We won't need to self-explanatory. Okay, it's a negative commandment to make no paving stone in order to bow down to the ground on it, even to Hashem. And it says so in Vayikra, if someone bowed down on it, spreading his hands and feet in prostration to the blessed God, like what we do in Yom Kippur, he should be given whiplashes. If it was without spreading hands and feet in prostration, he should be beaten with whiplashes of disobedience. If he bowed down on it in idol worship, whether with or without such prostration, he would deserve death by stoning. In a shul paved with stones, it is necessary to spread the mats or some kind of straw and stubble on the ground, as it mentions during the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur service. Okay, so it's basically how people did Avodah Zarah, how they actually performed the service. So you can't replicate that because maybe people are doing that. Anyway, I think that's self-explanatory, guys. Okay, then the next one is, it's a negative commandment to erect no pillar anywhere at all. And the pillar denotes a pile of stones. Even to worship Hashem, it is forbidden to construct it, since this was the way of the heathen. If someone transgressed it and erected a pillar in any location whatsoever, even to worship the blessed Hashem, he should be given whiplashes. So just go to shul. That's it, or just have it on your own. No objects. I think that's okay. Then the next one. Do you object to that? No, everything okay? Okay, let me continue. Okay, then the next one says, okay, this is slightly different. It's a negative commandment to inscribe no tattooed marks in one's flesh. And it says in Vayikra, nor shall you tattoo any marking on yourselves. It is a tattooed marking when one incises in his flesh and fills the place of the incision with ink or other coloring matter. The person who transgresses this should be given whiplashes. But But it could also be if someone was tinok the mishpat, which is they didn't know and only learned later in life. There are I don't want to use the word exceptions, but there are the person they didn't know and they were totally ignorant, then they're not liable. If they find out later in
Especially
life,
if you
like
do tshuva.
yeah, exactly, like
Especially if
things
you
that
do
we do,
tshuva,
yeah.
The couple with it.
Exactly. Listen, just in your category of somebody that didn't know, it's not somebody that didn't know only that it was prohibited. It's somebody that didn't know that the Torah was true, and therefore, even though they heard it was prohibited, they didn't know that it was factual, the Torah, and it was correct. So not know doesn't only extend to the prohibition, because it's it's chapter 19 verse 23, by the way, but 28. But just as a matter of interest, I'm saying it's somebody that isn't aware that even the Torah is correct. It's not just that they don't know that
Yeah.
there is prohibition. That's the only thing I want to correct.